If you're over 60 and avoiding bread, rice, and potatoes because you've been told they'll spike your blood sugar, what if I told you there's a way to eat these foods without the glucose roller coaster? Not by switching to alternatives, not by giving up foods you love, but by understanding how your body processes carbohydrates after 60 and using precise timing strategies that change everything. Bread, rice, and potatoes aren't the enemy. They're sources of energy, comfort, and cultural connection. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. After age 60, your body's insulin signaling weakens, your cells become more resistant to glucose uptake, and the way your digestive system processes these starches fundamentally changes. What worked at 40 doesn't work at 65. Not because your body is broken, but because aging metabolism requires precision, not restriction. And this matters deeply. Blood sugar spikes don't just cause temporary fatigue. They accelerate cellular aging, increase inflammation, damage blood vessels, weaken insulin sensitivity further, and dramatically raise your risk of diabetes, heart disease, and cognitive decline. Every spike is a metabolic stress event. Over time, those events compound. Your pancreas works harder, your cells resist insulin more aggressively, and what begins as mild glucose intolerance becomes a chronic metabolic crisis. Here's what's really happening inside your body. When you eat bread, rice, or potatoes, those starches break down into glucose molecules that flood your bloodstream. In younger adults, insulin arrives like a well-trained team, shuttling glucose into muscle and liver cells efficiently. But after 60, that system degrades. Insulin receptors on your cells become less responsive, a condition called insulin resistance. Your pancreas has to produce more insulin just to achieve the same effect. Meanwhile, muscle mass declines, meaning you have less tissue capable of absorbing glucose. Digestive enzymes slow down, so starch breakdown becomes less controlled. Suddenly, what used to be a manageable glucose response becomes a dangerous spike. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Think of glucose as delivery trucks arriving at your cells. In younger adults, the docking stations work smoothly. Trucks unload quickly and everything flows. But in older adults, those docking stations are rusty. Trucks pile up in the bloodstream, waiting. That traffic jam is your blood sugar spike. And when glucose can't get into cells, it circulates longer, causing oxidative damage, glycation of proteins, and inflammatory cascades. This is why post-meal glucose control becomes one of the most critical health markers after 60. But here's the breakthrough. Doctors and metabolic researchers have discovered that you don't need to eliminate these foods. You need to change 3 things: the structure of the starch, the order in which you eat, and what you pair with those carbohydrates. These aren't theories, they're physiological mechanisms backed by clinical research. And they work because they address the root cause: slowing glucose absorption, improving insulin signaling, and reducing the metabolic burden on aging systems. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to eat bread, rice, and potatoes without blood sugar spikes. The cooling method that transforms starch structure and reduces glucose response by up to 40%. The meal sequencing strategy that lowers post-meal glucose by nearly 30%. The vinegar trick that improves insulin sensitivity before you even take your first bite. How to restructure your plate so every meal protects, not damages, your metabolic health. And importantly, this is not about deprivation, it's about precision. Small structural changes create massive physiological differences, especially after 60. If this kind of science-based, practical guidance resonates with you, consider subscribing. I create content like this to help you protect your metabolism, heart, and longevity through intelligent nutrition strategies. Next, I'll break down the first method, how cooling changes starch at the molecular level, and why reheated rice, potatoes, and pasta behave completely differently in your body than freshly cooked versions. Why blood sugar spikes after 60 are a metabolic emergency. Before we talk about solutions, you need to understand why glucose spikes are particularly dangerous in older adults. Because the issue isn't just the spike itself, it's what happens when aging physiology meets repeated glucose surges. Here's what research tells us. After age 60, insulin resistance increases progressively, even in healthy adults. Muscle mass declines, reducing your body's largest glucose storage reservoir. Pancreatic beta cells, which produce insulin, become less efficient and more easily exhausted. Digestive enzyme production drops, meaning carbohydrate breakdown becomes less regulated. Cellular energy production in mitochondria weakens, so your cells become less capable of using glucose even when insulin signals properly. This creates a perfect storm. You're less able to handle glucose, and your body is less equipped to recover from spikes. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Think of your metabolism as a water management system. In younger adults, heavy rain, glucose, flows into large reservoirs, muscles, with strong pumps, insulin, that distribute water efficiently. But in older adults, the reservoirs have shrunk, the pumps are weaker, and the drainage system is slower. When the same amount of rain arrives, flooding happens. That flooding is your blood sugar spike. And just like flood damage weakens infrastructure, glucose spikes damage blood vessels, nerves, and organs over time. One critical factor is what happens during a spike. When glucose rises rapidly, your pancreas releases a massive insulin surge to compensate. In insulin-resistant individuals, this creates a secondary problem, reactive hypoglycemia. Blood sugar drops too low hours later, triggering hunger, cravings, fatigue, and stress hormone release. This starts a vicious cycle. You eat more carbohydrates to feel better. Glucose spikes again, insulin surges again, and your metabolic health degrades progressively with each cycle. Another overlooked consequence is glycation. When glucose stays elevated, it binds to proteins in your bloodstream, forming compounds called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. These molecules damage blood vessel linings, accelerate arterial stiffness, impair kidney function, and contribute to cognitive decline. AGEs accumulate over decades, but the rate of accumulation is directly tied to how often and how high your blood sugar spikes. Controlling those spikes isn't just about feeling better today, it's about preventing irreversible damage that accumulates silently over years. Inflammation is another pathway. Glucose spikes activate inflammatory signaling molecules called cytokines. In older adults who already experience chronic low-grade inflammation due to aging, these spikes add fuel to the fire. The result is accelerated cellular aging, increased risk of autoimmune conditions, joint pain, and cardiovascular stress. Every spike is an inflammatory event. The more frequent they are, the faster your body ages. So when we talk about eating bread, rice, and potatoes without spikes, we're not talking about convenience. We're talking about preserving your metabolic machinery, protecting your blood vessels, reducing inflammation, and maintaining insulin sensitivity. This is foundational to longevity after 60. Now, let me show you exactly how to achieve it. Method 1. The cooling trick that transforms starch structure. Here's one of the most fascinating discoveries in carbohydrate metabolism. When you cook starchy foods like rice, potatoes, or pasta, then cool them in the refrigerator, something remarkable happens at the molecular level. The starch structure changes, and that structural change dramatically reduces how much glucose enters your bloodstream. Here's the science. Starch exists in two forms: digestible starch and resistant starch. Digestible starch breaks down quickly in your small intestine, flooding your bloodstream with glucose. Resistant starch, however, resists digestion. It passes through your small intestine largely intact and reaches your colon, where gut bacteria ferment it slowly. This produces short-chain fatty acids that improve insulin sensitivity, reduce inflammation, and stabilize blood sugar. The key insight is this: cooling cooked starch increases the resistant starch content by up to 40%. This process is called starch retrogradation. When you cook rice, potatoes, or pasta, heat causes starch molecules to swell and become gelatinized. They're highly digestible in this state. But when you cool those foods, the starch molecules realign into tighter, more crystalline structures that digestive enzymes can't easily break apart. The longer you cool them, the more resistant starch forms. Studies show that rice cooled for 24 hours can reduce post-meal glucose response by up to 40% compared to freshly cooked rice. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between a dangerous spike and a gentle, controlled rise. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Think of freshly cooked starch as loose, fluffy cotton. Digestive enzymes can easily pull it apart. But cooled starch is like tightly woven fabric. The same enzymes have to work much harder, slowing the breakdown and glucose release. This means your blood sugar rises gradually instead of surging, giving your insulin system time to respond proportionally instead of desperately. Now here's the practical application. You don't have to eat cold rice or potatoes to get this benefit. Once resistant starch forms through cooling, reheating the food doesn't destroy it. You can cook rice, cool it overnight in the refrigerator, then reheat it the next day, and you'll still get significantly more resistant starch than if you'd eaten it freshly cooked. The same applies to potatoes. Boil or bake them, refrigerate overnight, then reheat. The starch structure has changed permanently. Your body processes it differently. This matters enormously for seniors. Because resistant starch doesn't just reduce glucose spikes, it also feeds beneficial gut bacteria, which produce compounds that improve insulin sensitivity systemically. In older adults, whose gut microbiomes often become less diverse with age, resistant starch acts as a prebiotic, restoring metabolic balance. Additionally, because resistant starch is digested more slowly, it creates sustained energy release instead of the spike and crash pattern that exhausts aging pancreatic cells. One important detail: the type of starch matters. Rice, potatoes, and pasta all form resistant starch when cooled, but the amount varies. Potatoes tend to form the most, followed by rice, then pasta. If blood sugar control is your priority, prioritize cooled potatoes in your meals. Cook a batch on Sunday, refrigerate them, and reheat portions throughout the week. This single habit can transform your glucose response without eliminating a food you love. But cooling is just the first lever. The second method is even more powerful especially when combined with the first. And it has to do with the order in which you eat the foods on your plate. Method 2. Meal sequencing. Eating carbs last changes everything. Here's a question most people never ask. Does the order in which you eat foods on your plate matter for blood sugar? The answer, according to multiple clinical studies, is absolutely yes. And the effect is so powerful that eating the same meal in a different sequence can reduce your glucose spike by up to 30%. Here's how it works. When you eat vegetables and protein first, before touching carbohydrates, several protective mechanisms activate. First, fiber from vegetables forms a gel-like matrix in your stomach and small intestine. This physically slows the movement of food through your digestive tract, meaning glucose is released more gradually. Second, protein stimulates the release of hormones like GLP-1 and PYY, which slow gastric emptying and improve insulin secretion. Third, fat from protein sources delays carbohydrate digestion even further. By the time you eat bread, rice, or potatoes, your digestive system is primed to handle them slowly and efficiently. Research demonstrates this clearly. In one study, participants ate the exact same meal: chicken, vegetables, and rice. When they ate the rice first, their blood sugar spiked rapidly. When they ate vegetables and chicken first, then rice last, their glucose response was 29% lower at the 30-minute mark and 37% lower at 60 minutes. Their insulin levels were also significantly lower, meaning their pancreas didn't have to work as hard. Same food, different order, completely different metabolic outcome. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Think of your digestive system as a highway. If carbohydrates enter first, they speed through unobstructed, dumping glucose into your bloodstream all at once. But if fiber and protein enter first, they create a controlled traffic flow. Carbohydrates now have to merge slowly, releasing glucose gradually. The destination is the same, but the journey is controlled, not chaotic. This strategy is especially critical for adults over 60. Because aging slows gastric emptying naturally, eating in the right order amplifies that protective effect. Your body already has a tendency to digest more slowly. By eating vegetables and protein first, you're working with that tendency instead of against it. The result is blood sugar stability that younger adults achieve naturally, but older adults must engineer intentionally. Here's the practical application. Restructure every meal so it follows this sequence. Vegetables first, protein second, carbohydrates last. If you're eating a meal with rice, start with a salad or steamed vegetables. Eat your chicken, fish, or eggs next. Finish with the rice. If you're eating bread, have it after you've consumed protein and fiber. This doesn't require different foods or complicated recipes. It's simply reordering what's already on your plate. One important nuance: the effect is dose dependent. The more fiber and protein you eat before carbohydrates, the stronger the glucose blunting effect. This means portion size matters. If you eat 2 bites of salad, then a mountain of pasta, the benefit will be minimal. But if you eat a substantial portion of vegetables and protein first, the carbohydrate portion can be moderate without causing a spike. This gives you flexibility. You're not eliminating carbs. You're creating the conditions for your body to handle them safely. Another critical detail: timing between food groups matters. Don't rush through vegetables to get to the carbs. Give your body 5 to 10 minutes to start digesting the fiber and protein before introducing starch. This allows the protective hormones and gastric mechanisms to fully activate. In practical terms, This might mean eating your salad or vegetable side completely before moving to the main carbohydrate. It feels unusual at first, but the metabolic benefit is profound. Now, here's where it gets even more powerful. When you combine meal sequencing with the cooling method, you're stacking two independent glucose-lowering mechanisms. Cooled, resistant starch rice, eaten after vegetables and protein, delivers a 1-2 punch that can reduce your glucose response by 50% or more compared to eating freshly cooked rice on an empty stomach. That's the difference between metabolic stress and metabolic stability. And there's one more method that amplifies both of these strategies even further. Method 3, the vinegar strategy that primes your metabolism. Here's something that sounds almost too simple to be true, but the science is remarkably consistent. Consuming vinegar before or with a carbohydrate-rich meal can reduce your blood sugar spike by 20 to 30%. And the mechanism is precise, measurable, and particularly effective in older adults with insulin resistance. Here's what happens. Vinegar contains acetic acid, which does two things simultaneously. First, it slows down the enzyme amylase, which breaks starch into glucose. When amylase works more slowly, glucose is released more gradually into your bloodstream. Second, acetic acid improves insulin sensitivity at the cellular level, meaning your muscle and liver cells respond more efficiently to insulin signals and absorb glucose faster. This creates a double benefit: slower glucose release and faster glucose clearance. Research shows the effect consistently. In multiple studies, participants who consumed 1 to 2 tablespoons of vinegar diluted in water before a high carbohydrate meal experienced significantly lower post-meal glucose and insulin levels compared to control groups. The effect is strongest in individuals with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, which describes a large percentage of adults over 60. What's particularly interesting is that vinegar doesn't just lower the peak glucose level. It also reduces the area under the glucose curve, meaning your blood sugar stays lower for longer after the meal. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Think of glucose entering your bloodstream as water flowing from a faucet. Normally, when you eat starch, the faucet opens fully and quickly. Vinegar turns that faucet down to a slower, steadier flow. Meanwhile, it also increases the drain capacity, so water, glucose, exits your bloodstream faster. The result is a shallower, shorter spike. This is especially valuable for seniors because acetic acid works independently of insulin secretion. Even if your pancreas is tired or your cells are insulin resistant, vinegar improves glucose handling through alternative pathways. It activates AMPK, an enzyme that tells cells to absorb glucose even without strong insulin signaling. This makes vinegar a metabolic insurance policy, effective even when your natural systems are weakened by age. Here's the practical application. Before meals containing bread, rice, or potatoes, drink a glass of water with 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar or any vinegar mixed in. The type of vinegar doesn't matter significantly. Apple cider, white, red wine, or balsamic all contain acetic acid. The key is consuming it 10 to 15 minutes before eating or at the start of the meal. This gives the acetic acid time to enter your digestive system and begins slowing enzyme activity before starch arrives. One important detail. Start with 1 tablespoon if you're new to this. Some people experience mild stomach discomfort with vinegar, especially on an empty stomach. If that happens, Reduce the amount or consume it with the first bites of your meal instead of before. Over time, your tolerance will improve. Also, always dilute vinegar in water. Undiluted vinegar can damage tooth enamel and irritate your esophagus. Mix it thoroughly and drink it like any other beverage. Here's where the strategy becomes exponentially powerful. When you combine vinegar with meal sequencing and resistant starch, you're creating a metabolic environment where blood sugar spikes become nearly impossible. Vinegar slows starch digestion. Resistant starch resists digestion structurally. Eating vegetables and protein first slows digestion mechanically and hormonally. These three mechanisms work on different pathways, so their effects multiply rather than simply add together. This is how you eat bread, rice, and potatoes without spikes, not by restriction, but by precision. But there's one more layer to this that most people miss, and it has to do with how you prepare these foods in the first place and what you pair them with on the plate to further blunt glucose response. Method 4. Pairing strategies that stabilize glucose naturally. Even if you use cooling, meal sequencing, and vinegar, the composition of your meal still matters. What you pair with carbohydrates determines how your body processes them, and certain combinations create synergistic effects that protect your blood sugar far beyond what any single food can achieve. Here's the principle. Carbohydrates eaten alone digest rapidly and spike glucose, but when paired with fiber, protein, and healthy fats, their digestion slows dramatically. This isn't just about adding nutrients. It's about creating a meal matrix that controls glucose release at every stage of digestion.